There's a
Yeah.
great quote from Alan Kay, one of the pioneers of personal computing, who invented a lot of the stuff we use today. He thought that software should kind of the quote is something like surreptitiously pull the user into modifying it,
Yeah.
so you don't even realize it's happening, and then at some point you've changed it to be yours.
Hey, Luca here. Welcome to a new episode of the Refactoring Podcast, where every 2 weeks we interview a world-class tech leader. Today's guest is Geoffrey Litt, design engineer at Notion. With Geoffrey, we talked about Malleable software, a type of platform that kind of always existed, but is now getting new meaning and opportunity thanks to AI. And then we talked about how Notion itself changed its place in the ecosystem with AI agents first, and now with the new developer platform where you can ship code directly inside Notion. And finally, we talked about how Notion builds Notion, designers shipping code to production, internal prototyping, feature flags, and more. So let's dive right into it. Welcome, Geoffrey, and thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, Geoffrey, I'm so excited to have this chat. You're a design engineer at Notion, and as you say in your website, you're interested in creating malleable software. And I think there is a lot to unpack here already, because first of all, design engineer is not a title you hear exactly every day. And then malleable software, I think deserves an explanation. So let's start with that. Can you walk me through it, and what do you mean by that?
Yeah, maybe I'll start with a story of how I got into this. So my first job out of college, I was working at a startup, and we were building education software for schools. And we worked with a lot of schools across the United States, a little elementary school in Kansas, like a huge high school in New York City. And we would get all of this feedback from these schools, like, oh, could you change this one word in your product or change this one button or something? And usually the answer is no, right?
Yeah,
We're making decisions. We make the product, and you don't get to tell us what to do. But this really bugged me because often they were right for their
yeah,
one school, but it didn't make sense for everyone else. And we had to make a one size fits all solution for every school, right? And it
yeah,
just started bugging me, like, why is software so centralized where this little, group of people at some company decides what everyone does?
yeah,
And at the same time, we would talk to customers who were like, you know what, we're just going to use a spreadsheet. And the
yeah,
spreadsheet is lacking a lot of the features of like a proper app. But
yeah,
on the other hand, they could choose the colors, and they could choose the
yeah,
words, and they could choose the formulas that are used to calculate things. And there's all these other benefits they got from being able to tailor the software to exactly what they needed. And so when I think of what malleable software is, I think it's about how can we kind of get the best of both worlds there? How can we have software that has all the power of like, what we call real software with like real code and real apps, but at the same time distribute more of that power and decision making over how our tools work to individuals, to teams, to companies using and all sorts of teams using things, rather than
yeah.
having it all in some corporation that makes the software.
Yeah, I love that. And I feel, I love the example too. And I feel there is kind of a tension, right, between the two ends of the spectrum between, I don't know, something that is too maybe blank or basic, like spreadsheets, right? I mean, that you can do anything with it, but there are very little like constraints. You have to like invent everything from scratch, and I don't know, standard SaaS, that it's just structured in one way, and you can't customize anything. So it's kind of finding a middle ground, like Notion does, and like other software that need to strike that balance between being a good fit but still give you some room for customizing it for your use case. That's what you mean.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the ideal that I think we should be striving for, and which we try to nail at Notion, is yes, it's partly a balance, but I also think of it in kind of layers. And so,
Hmm.
like, when you get started, it should feel like someone else made the decisions, and you don't need to like it's not a blank canvas like a spreadsheet. It's an app that is already there,
Yeah,
and there's a bunch of good opinions baked in. But then over time, as you get familiar with it and you have your own opinions and you want to change stuff,
yeah,
you should be able to dig deeper and deeper and deeper into the layers of the software and
yeah,
change it in more and more powerful ways as you go. And ideally, the software should kind of gradually pull you into that process naturally. So over
yeah,
the years, it kind of molds to you organically. There's a
Yeah.
great quote from Alan Kay, one of the pioneers of personal computing, who invented a lot of the stuff we use today. He thought that software should kind of the quote is something like surreptitiously pull the user into modifying it,
Yeah.
so you don't even realize it's happening, and then at some point you've changed it to be yours.
Hey, before we continue, I was reading the X 2026 survey on how AI is impacting developer productivity, and the results were kind of surprising. One of the main call-outs is that AI tools still lack critical context. This is how they describe it. An AI assistant can't reason over a Slack thread from an archive channel or the mental model of the engineer who built it. So now that we are all coding with agents, it's clear that the gap is not a bigger context window or adding another MCP server. Until agents have the same tribal knowledge you have, the value you get from them is still limited. And this is exactly the type of problem our sponsor today, Unblocked, is solving for tens of thousands of developers. Unblocked is the context layer for modern engineering teams. It brings together your PRs, docs, conversations, tickets, and more, turning them into actionable context for both your team and their AI agents. Engineering teams that are getting ahead right now use a context engine like Unblocked to make better plans, write higher quality code, use fewer tokens, and spend less time in review cycles. So if you're running Claude Code, Cursor, or any agentic workflow, give Unblocked a try. Get a free 3-week trial at getunblocked.com/refactoring. Yeah, I love that. And I went through your website and many of your blog posts, and I like how you describe Malleable software as not something that needs to aggressively hide complexity from the user all the time, or hide structure, but choose selectively what kind of structure is worth to expose, because you want the user to understand and learn how to use that. And you made that great example of the nightmare bicycle, right? Can you explain it to people that don't know it?
Yeah, the nightmare bicycle is one of my favorite parables of product design. It's the story that shows up in a book called Changing Minds by Andre de Sessa, who's a brilliant education researcher. And he talks about having this nightmare where he's riding a bicycle and the gears don't have numbers on them, but they have labeled modes. Like, this is the gravel gear, and this is the uphill gear, and this is the downhill gear. And it's a really confusing bike to ride because what if you're going uphill on gravel? What do? You don't know, right? And he talks about how the product manager who designed this bike, the reason they did it that way is, oh, people don't know math. People can't understand numbers. That would be crazy. We have to explain it to the user and be user friendly, so we're going to do these modes. But what he explains is that when you label things that way, you're robbing the user of some coherent underlying mental model that they can use to kind of understand what's really going on and apply it to new situations. And actually, humans are very smart. Like, humans are very capable of learning things as long as they're presented in the right way. And that's part of what we try to do at Notion, I think, is if you have an app that has 1 million settings toggles, that's going to be really confusing. That's not what Malleable software means. What Malleable software means is having a smaller set of primitive components that can be reassembled to make anything, and to do a really good job introducing and teaching those components to everyone using the software, just like bicycle gears.
Yeah, I love how I think to anyone hearing this is 100% sensible and rational, yet I think it's easier said than done, because I remember reading that example, right? And of course, I thought this would be an awful idea not to have numbered gears, but there was a part of my brain who also thought, yeah, that makes sense, right? Like a PM could easily come up with that. And to some extent, right, a user might not know that you need to use, I don't know, gear 1 or gear 2 to go downhill, right? And so I wonder if, there is some kind of trade-off where you accept to make the users go through some slight level of discomfort at the beginning, right? Because you want to teach them something, but that's worth it in the long run.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the right framing. There is a trade-off. It's funny, I posted that blog post about the Nightmare Bicycle, and I had some people who were involved with like the bike rental programs in various cities telling me actually a lot of people don't know how to use gears and they
Yeah,
get really confused when they first get on one of these bikes. And so I think you are paying some upfront cost of learning,
yeah,
and it might be a little harder to get started, but the idea is that very quickly that starts paying off and you hit break even, and then you hit escape velocity where you're getting tons of compounding benefits from that framework
yeah,
being in your head. I do think at Notion and in any malleable software system, solving that first user experience is a
mm,
really hard part of it, because it is going to often be a little bit harder to get started than a
yeah,
perfectly packaged application that's just made for that one thing. And so a lot of what I think about and we think about at Notion is how can we provide things like templates and other
yeah,
mechanisms to give you a starting point so it doesn't feel too scary. And then how can we progressively disclose the concepts that you need to learn? So
yeah,
you don't want to take a class to be able to do anything, right? Spreadsheets actually is a really good example of progressive disclosure, where you can use a spreadsheet to type down some numbers or some text
yeah,
without even knowing anything about formulas, for example. You don't even
yeah,
need to know that formulas exist to start using a spreadsheet, right? And then when you're ready, you can do a formula. And I think tools like Notion should be similar, where you can just start typing some text. You don't need to like learn about what databases are or what AI agents are.
yeah.
You can just write a document and share it with your team and then go from there.
Yeah, I actually, this remembers, I had an interview with Guillermo Rauch, the CEO of Vercel, a few months back, and he told me he believes in this idea that it's exactly what you said about progressive disclosure of complexity, where the user is disclosed to the complexity is disclosed just in time, when the user needs it and not before. And the great technology should be capable both of being used to do very small things, like in the case of Vercel, he meant like just powering a small website, and at the same time scale to a Fortune 500.
Yeah, exactly. And I actually think this is one of the biggest problems with the traditional way of building software, is that it really lacks this progressive complexity. So
Mm,
before AI, if you told a random person, hey, can you go build a web application? Think about, the number of concepts you need to learn to
yeah,
do anything. And it's not just like, sure, there's programming, the essence of programming, which is like a pretty difficult thing to learn, but there's also like the terminal and,
yeah,
you know, how to use Git. There's all these other concepts that stack on each other. And so I think of to democratize software creation, we're getting rid of some of those barriers now, and I think AI agents are doing a lot there.
yeah,
But even still, there's still quite a lot of friction in really making software that people can actually use,
yeah,
even if you're using AI agents, because where do you deploy it? Like, how do
yeah,
you maintain and scale an application?
yeah.
There's all these parts that are still hard. And I think the opportunity we have at Notion is to say, actually, the best starting point for shipping software to your team is not necessarily starting with arbitrary code. It's actually starting
Mm,
with something more approachable, like
yeah.
just make a database and go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. And so speaking of, since you're mentioning Notion and speaking of Notion relationship with the things we have said so far about malleable software, constraints, and the nightmare bicycle itself, what is some example of structure that you intentionally like expose in Notion? You decide that the user needs to learn this as opposed to, I don't know, making things a little bit simpler from the get-go, but then it would come back biting.
I think a great place to start is blocks. So,
Uh,
for those who aren't familiar, Notion is a block-based editor, and that
yeah,
means that when you type a document, every paragraph is its own little unit that you can drag around. Um, if you add a heading, that's a different kind of block, and then there's actually a lot of images. Each of these is like its own self-contained unit, and I think sometimes that can be a little unfamiliar to people who are used to something like Google Docs, which doesn't have this concept.
yeah,
Um, and you might need to learn some new ways of using your editor and stuff. But then what's interesting is that as you start using it more and more, you get a lot of leverage from this concept. So, for example, you can say, I want to sync this block to this other document and see it in both
Yeah.
places. You can nest blocks inside of each other by just like selecting and dragging them.
Yeah.
There's all these benefits you start getting. And so, part of our challenge is teaching you about blocks and why they're great. But I think most Notion users, once they get familiar, really do see the benefits. So that's one example. I'll throw another example that's a little more advanced, maybe, that I really like, which is you can make these agents in Notion that do repeated AI workflows for you. And the instructions for a Notion agent is just a Notion page. So you can write down a Notion page that uses all the affordances that you have in any Notion page. This is really different from a lot of other platforms for making AI agents. You're like typing Markdown or like just like plain text. Whereas in Notion, you can have images, you can do like synced blocks from other pages, you can do embedded subpages that have more detailed instructions. You can have embedded databases that have structured data. There's all these really rich editor affordances you can use to specify the instructions for your AI agent that enable all these cool patterns. And the neat thing is, if you already know how to use a Notion page, there's nothing new to learn.
Yeah.
You say, oh, that's just a page. Now I know. And so that's a perfect example of where reusing the same primitives can help.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think it's a perfect example because, as you said, if you don't know anything about blocks and pages, this looks more complicated than just writing like a simple text file in Markdown. But if you know the primitives, it's easier actually, because you can give richer context, blocks can do more, there are images, there is synced content, so it's easier to do more sophisticated stuff because you have spent time and effort learning the basics of the platform.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And again, we got to make that first introduction as easy as possible. But
yeah. So you've mentioned agents, and you've mentioned the opportunity now that there is with AI that to probably make malleable software more powerful than ever, right? And there are a lot of narratives around. I think nobody knows, what the future will bring in terms of. There are people who think users will just go around creating custom tools for everything, but doing that from scratch. I mean, maybe it will happen, maybe not. Or maybe they will start from platforms and malleable software like Notion. What's your take on this? Where do you see this going?
Yeah, so I think there's room for all of these approaches, but I think that the create from scratch approach has some really big downsides that people maybe haven't fully realized or encountered yet. So when you think about the complexity that goes into an application that you actually want to use for like real work or like some serious load-bearing use case, there's a lot of things you need to think about around, like, I'll take a random example, like permissions. Like, permissions and access control is a huge thing that probably you don't want to spend a lot of effort thinking about, but you actually do have to figure out for like a serious work tool. And there's a lot of other concerns that are like that are hard to handle. And so my take is that, I love vibe coding tiny personal utilities that I just use for random stuff in my personal life or, solo. But the moment you get to like collaboration and using them at work, I think you end up wanting a platform that's a little more batteries included or has more of this stuff built in. So the way I think we think about it at Notion is that, again, you want to smoothly upgrade from pages and databases and these simple concepts. You want to add in AI agents so that you can then very quickly create any sort of tooling you want in Notion without needing to click all the buttons yourself, right? You can just say, I want a tracker for this. I want to ingest data from here. That should all be automatic. Instead of having random custom UIs for everything, you can then reuse familiar UIs that we've built for you, like a great database table view or Kanban board or map view, so you don't have to build that from scratch. You have building blocks. And then I think the last layer that we're now adding is our new developer platform. So the reality is there's always going to be things that are not built in to Notion or built into any platform. And to close that last gap, you are going to need custom code in some form.
Yeah.
So the new stuff we're announcing, or that we recently announced, is we have this new platform called Workers that lets
Yeah.
you write custom code, often with a coding agent probably, and then you can ship that to Notion and deploy it, and then it will handle executing it securely.
Yeah.
And so the philosophy there is let's find the key extension points that are really valuable to actually
Yeah.
have custom code and let you extend it there. So syncing any data into Notion, giving any custom tool to your AI agent. These are places where it turns out to be really helpful to have that last mile customization. But the point is, you're not writing some giant code base from scratch. You're building up with really good building blocks and then only building custom where you really need to.
Yeah, I want to ask you a lot about the developer platform because I mean I've been using Notion for a long time. I think since like 2017 or something before databases were even in Notion. So I remember a lot of things. I remember when I mean that Notion for a long time even resisted having an API, right? I remember those days. And now the shift that Notion has had over the last year, to me, it's incredible, both in in breadth and scale in terms of an agent platform, but also in the speed at which this has happened. I mean, my feeling working in my workspace is that Notion has changed very fast and has adopted this very fast. And the latest developer platform with the ability to create workers to embed code inside Notion, it feels like even the way Notion sees itself in the whole ecosystem has changed a little bit. It's more, I mean, in the past, my feeling was that you can do everything in Notion, right? Maybe you can plug this and that, but it's more like that's more like an afterthought. Now, instead, let's embrace this role of being a hub that connects all the other things that we know you have on other tools and other platforms, and use Notion to traffic control this. Does that make sense?
Totally. For context, I only joined the company last September, so I've only been around for a bit, but I have been using it for a very long time, just like you.
Yeah.
And I think you're on the money. That's exactly the shift that's happening. And a lot of it is because of AI, actually. So AI is changing a couple important things. Where first of all, it's always been the goal to have Notion be the hub for all of your context and all of your information so you're not siloed. But the value of that, I think, has really increased with AI agents because
Yeah.
if you ask a question of your agent, you want it to have all the context that you have. And some of that's in Notion and some of it's not. So we have really great first-party connectors to things like, Slack. But also you want to be able to connect it to like your internal tools that are custom built or to random other data sources that don't have MCP. And so it's
Yeah.
the value of truly having all the context accessible is really important. And a lot of teams struggle to find a place to put it. And we think Notion's a great place to put it. So that's one of the things driving it. I think the second factor is coding agents have gotten really good over the past year. And what that means is that, our traditional Notion audience is not people who can program, right? In fact, it's kind of almost the opposite of like it's for the people who can't program to build custom tools. But now I think the number of people who can do a little bit of programming has just gone way up. And we
Yeah.
have all these cool stories of people building really valuable Notion workers who are not traditional programmers because they have coding agents. And so
Yeah.
the accessibility of this stuff is really proliferating. And so because of that, I think it's a really golden opportunity for us to kind of invest in serving developers broadly, not just
Yeah.
traditional developers, but also like kind of everyone's a developer now,
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I remember uh, got another interview a few months ago, and with an engineering leader who was spearheading AI coding adoption in the company, and he set this bar that he didn't just want like 100% of engineers to use AI. He said that go like higher than 100% because he wanted non-engineers to get involved, like 120%, right? And if you can, make this contribution like productive in the workflow, there are just these great sources of insights and inputs that can come from anywhere in the team. But I think the challenge is how to make them fit the overall process of the team.
Yeah, that's something really cool we've been seeing at Notion is, you know, part of the benefit of Notion is that it's a horizontal tool that's kind of meant for like all teams, and a lot of teams adopt it across the entire team, regardless of role.
Yeah.
And that's a contrast to other tools that tend to be more vertically siloed, of like this one's only for the engineers or whatever.
Yeah.
And the benefit of that now is that role boundaries are starting to shift. So, for
Mm.
example, my team is working on bringing coding agents into Notion, and we can
Mm.
talk more about that. But uh, a lot of the interesting stories we've heard are people who are not necessarily traditional engineers using those coding agents to get things done because now they're so easily accessible inside of Notion. And this could be anyone from, designers who are kind of adjacent but maybe less involved in day-to-day engineering, all the way to like we've heard stories of executives. Actually, inside of Notion, we've even had executives like Ivan, our CEO, has been shipping a little bit of stuff to our app these days. He's not obviously used. He does have programming background and he built a lot of the original Notion, but these days he's
Of
not in that
course.
day to day.
Yeah.
But because it's easier for him to contribute, because he can just fire off an agent from within Notion, it kind of makes it possible for him to play in that space again. And so um, that's something that I find very exciting is the idea of treating role boundaries as
Yeah.
less as more fluid.
Yeah. So you got me curious now. You said that your team is working on bringing AI coding agents inside Notion. What's that mean exactly?
Yeah. So the backdrop here is that we think Notion is a really good place to do agent orchestration.
Mm.
And, that's kind of it's a buzzword. Everyone's talking about it. When I think about what that means, it's very simple. We're all using agents to do stuff now, and it can be hard to keep track of it. If you're running different coding agents for different tasks and you have other agents running, I often get kind of lost even remembering like what do I have going on.
See.
And it becomes really valuable to have some place to keep track of all of it. And also ideally to share that with your team in some way. And so Notion is already a collaborative space that you can use with your human teammates, and now we're extending that so you can have all of your AI teammates there. And this was already true with the Notion Agent platform that we fully launched a couple months ago. And so, for example, you can have a task board and have Notion agents working on the tasks, and everyone on the team can see them. But a lot of our users were also telling us, hey, we don't just use Notion agents. We
Yeah.
have Claude coding agents that we love. We
Mm.
have these customer support agents from other vendors that we're using.
Yeah.
And those are in their own silos today.
Yeah.
And we would love to have them in Notion too. We had one customer who told us, I want my whole team spending the entire day in Notion so you don't have to keep switching tools, right? And to enable that, we need to bring all the agents into Notion. So we announced recently that we're working on external agents in Notion, where the idea is very simple. You should be able to talk to and trigger all of your AI agents that your team is using from within the Notion UI and track it and orchestrate it all right there. And so one really good use case for this is coding agents.
Yeah.
Notion agent can't code today, but there's great coding agents out there that are really valuable. And so
Mhm.
what we're building is the ability to take a PRD that you have in Notion and just tag, hey, Claude, can you build this?
Yeah.
Have a task board, you drag a task, and Codex automatically kicks off and starts building it. Those are the kinds of interactions that people are finding really magical.
Yeah.
And so that's what we're building.
I think it makes a lot of sense because, I mean, in my own experience, I remember changing my mind about a lot of things when it comes to AI agents when I started using OpenClaw specifically, because all of a sudden I saw how different the experience would be when you could have an agent having access to all of your context and tools and workspace, which made me think, I mean, the only good way of using agents is in a horizontal way. I mean, if they have access to everything, because for example, I mean, I have an AI agent inside my email client, but it only has access to emails, not to meeting notes or my calendar or this and that. And so it's terrible at drafting emails. While instead my OpenClaw, it's very good because it can see everything. But at the same time, I think there are very few companies that can realistically like go for it. right? Because they have all the pieces of the puzzle of the workspace. And to me, it's like it's Google, it's Microsoft, and it's Notion that has also email, has calendar, has the whole workspace thing. So it's exciting, and it's also one of the few points where it really makes sense to try to build this thing.
Yeah, I think that the analogy to OpenClaw is really great. And
Yeah.
um, sometimes I think of Notion as like OpenClaw for teams and for work. You know,
Yeah.
OpenClaw is really cool, but like uh, having a thing that's based around local files and single player doesn't really make sense in a lot of contexts. And so you need the shared context, and you need it in some like environment with guardrails that are appropriate
Yeah.
for like business use cases. And I think that's basically what we're trying to do. And
Yeah.
I'll also tell you an example of, just like your email thing, we're finding that coding agents also thrive on context. So
Mm.
by default, right, every coding agent has like access to the code base, which is a really good source of context. But it turns out there's also lots of other context that's really valuable. This could be like uh, product documents, design documents. It could be Slack conversations. And if you run them in Notion, you get access to all that context really easily. We have, there's one agent that I made that we really are enjoying, which is we have this internal Slack channel where people give feedback on our own product. And every single message there gets an agent that looks at it. It digs around and sees, have we talked about this issue before? Are there Notion pages about this feature that
Mm.
explain how it's supposed to work? Which teams are supposed to be involved with this? And we, digs that out of our Notion workspace. So it has all this surrounding context. And then it hands it to a Claude coding agent to actually investigate in the product code what is the cause of this. And then all of that gets bundled together into a report that's a
Yeah.
Notion page that's like, here's the result of the investigation. This one would be really easy to fix. Here's basically what you need to do, and that's the team that needs to do it. And this is, it's when it works, it's awesome to have this happening automatically, and it really requires like that horizontal context thing that you just mentioned.
Yeah. Yeah. It's exactly the type of example that I was referring to. I mean, having access to all the information basically unleashes the opportunities for autonomy and also the agents being more accurate in what they do. And I'm wondering, I mean, this, as you said, the original agent platform just came out a few months ago, and this whole shift in Notion has happened so fast. And how was it like from the inside, even rolling this out and implementing this from a technical standpoint? Did this require a shift in your platform, or like agents fit nicely your existing abstractions? Like you might say they're just like people, like the participants of the workspace that do things like, and so it came natural, or maybe it was a nightmare to make all of these things fit and so on.
Yeah, we are still so early as an industry in figuring out the right patterns for people and AIs to collaborate.
Yeah.
I think that I'm always surprised by how far you can get with the very simple model of anywhere that I could do something with a person, I should also be able to do it with an AI.
Yeah.
I don't think that's the final shape of the whole thing, or that's the only way, but it's a really good basic principle. You know, when I have a comment thread where I can mention a teammate to ask them to do something, I should be able to mention any of my AI agents in that place. That's like a good example of the kind of thing that where it fits really cleanly. I think there are also places where that starts to break down, though, and where you have to think of agents and humans differently. A big one is around trust. So,
Mm.
um, in a Notion workspace, for example, you can have various people and you can set permissions guardrails for what they're able to edit. But for the most part, I think you kind of assume pretty high trust within a workspace. So, you might have important company documents that are technically editable by anyone. But you wouldn't expect a random employee to just go crazy and like mess it
Yeah.
up on purpose, right? Whereas with AI agents, um, they are kind of just less reliable. They can go
Yeah.
rogue more often. And the way that I think about it is that there's this very tricky tension you want to navigate where, in order for agents to be really valuable, you need them to be able to do a lot of stuff, to have a big scope where they can actually send emails, they can actually
Yeah.
edit your workspace. But on the other hand, you don't fully trust them. And often you need to inject human review. So then the challenge becomes, okay, how do we provide that oversight layer by
Mm.
humans in the right way so that you're not totally hamstringing the agent and putting it in a box, but also you don't end up with really bad outcomes.
Yeah.
And a big source of inspiration for me that we look to in our product too is actually version control from
Mm.
coding, and software engineering. Because if you think about it, one of the biggest reasons that coding agents make sense is that GitHub exists. Um, you can make a pull request, and if it's terrible, it's not
Yeah.
a big deal. Just throw it away. Or if it's close, you edit it.
Yeah.
And if you
Or
don't
even if you
have
want to revert, it's easier. Yeah.
exactly, you have good controls for undoing. And so um, I worked on a project that we shipped early this year where we're giving you better visibility into what the agent is editing when you work with it. So now in Notion, whenever your agent edits a page, you can see exactly what changes it made. And then, of course, you can directly edit from there or undo immediately. And having that fine-grained diffing of exactly what did it change
Yeah.
and the ability to review that lets you trust it way more to do bigger stuff. And so I think of it as kind of like you need to step up these controls and oversight things hand in hand with giving more scope of responsibility to AI
Yeah.
agents.
Yeah. I think this is a boundary that will keep moving in a way. And of course, it can go from, as it was with coding agents up to a few months back, you're just going to hold their hands and look closely at what they're doing line by line to we're just reviewing the pull requests to maybe we have good guardrails in place and we can optimistically like merge the work. And then if something is bad, we just revert. And I think it's like a journey. And I mean, it's hard by itself to figure out what's the right way and the right step of the process in which to step in as a human, and also how to how to measure. If you want to understand from a quantitative point of view, I mean, where should I jump in versus where I can it's safely is not the right word. I mean, it's the most effective strategy is to let go of more control, right? And even if it goes maybe against my instincts and get into the process at later stage. Yeah, that as an engineer myself and content creator, a lot of workflows, that's still something I struggle with because I'm not sure all the time.
Yeah. The first thing I'll say to that is I think that the progression you just described is totally natural, where what makes sense is to start by trusting it less. And then as you see its performance, you can trust it more and give it a longer leash. And I think, like you said, with coding agents, a lot of us run with less restrictions than maybe we used to because we've seen that they're capable of it now. So um, I think giving people the flexibility to decide how much to trust and starting with less trust makes sense. The other thing I'll say though is it's not just about deciding when to intervene. It's also like how can you make that human intervention step really nice and productive?
Hmm.
So, for example, what are you getting from the agent to help you understand what's going on? Is it just like in the coding agent case, it could give you just a bunch of code, or it could give you a really awesome explanation. And in fact, when we do coding agents in Notion, we have them produce these Notion pages explaining what they did, including like nice typography and even diagrams. And so
Yeah.
when I review code that my agent did, I don't look at the code first. I read that document first. Um, I still do read the code eventually, but it's like a uh, higher level first step, right?
Yeah.
The other thing is how do you make the review among a team really nice? So we love doing like collaborative reviews where if the agent comes and says, "Hey, I did this," I can leave a comment tagging my teammate saying, "What do you think? Like, is this weird?" And we can just talk about it right there instead of needing to, like, I don't know, send like a markdown file or something. And
Yeah.
so I think a lot of what we think about is human review is becoming the bottleneck, and the injection of human taste is becoming the bottleneck on these processes. So our tools need to do a really great job pulling us in at the right moments in a really productive way.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And speaking of this, I mean, you hinted at some ways you have been using agents in the coding process with your team. How have agents concretely changed how the engineering team that you work at or Notion at large is working? I mean, you yourself, your title is design engineer, which is already an unusual title with if you look at like 10 years ago, maybe. So what's the day in the life of Geoffrey at Notion?
So as a design engineer, I've always been a person who sort of straddles both design and engineering in the sense that I like thinking about how to make things that people love and interfaces, but I also like expressing that in the medium of code. And one of the things I personally find really important about that is that, there's this great quote, I think from Steve Jobs, that's something like design isn't just how it looks, it's how it works. And I really believe that a lot of the time, uh, beneath the visuals is there's some conceptual model that's there.
Mm,
And if that conceptual model is good, it can really um, provide a solid experience. They just feel it. You feel that it's right, and no amount of polish at the visual layer can cover up a bad conceptual model. It will leak through, and so that conceptual model is ultimately being expressed in the code. And so I
yeah,
think working in the medium of code can be a really effective way to work on those kinds of things. So
yeah,
that's my role, and I think to your question of how AI agents are changing stuff, I mean, yeah, everything is changing, I would say. It's hard to find a part that stayed the same. One part that's really stuck out to me is that, so as I mentioned, I just joined in September, and Notion is a big code base, right? So there's a lot to learn.
yeah.
My ability to ship code to our actual production app is so much accelerated by coding agents because they can get me up to speed on part of our code base and then work with me to understand um, the constraints and the spec that I want and actually ship a good PR. And because I also have engineering background, I'm actually, you know, I don't have the domain knowledge of every part of our code base, but I can work with the agent to figure it out. And we still do code review, but I can ship pretty fast to production. And for me, what that unlocks is we can have a really rapid experimentation loop that goes through production. And it's
Okay.
not just pictures, it's not just even internal prototypes in like some
Yeah,
fake way. It's truly shipping to prod as the testing
yeah,
loop. Literally, right before this interview, we were testing a new onboarding flow for something we're
yeah,
building that my colleague and I built in like a day or two.
yeah,
That I don't know, probably would have taken like a week before
yeah,
coding agents or something like that. And we're just trying it with people and seeing how they react
yeah,
to it. And then we'll iterate again today and ship a new one tomorrow, right? And I love that sort of the faster loops that you
yeah.
get to build better things.
So when you say testing things in actual production, do you do like canary releases, feature flagging, to release things just to a subset of customers and A/B testing? Um, how does it work? Do you go through a pre-production environment or a staging environment? And this more the technical, nerdy
Yeah.
questions.
Um, so everything starts in dev, our
Yeah,
internal release.
yeah,
And we always have lots of experimental stuff cooking in dev. And the bar to
yeah,
ship to ourselves is pretty low. Which is great because you can just try things and get a lot of feedback from, obviously we're using it ourselves every day, right?
yeah,
I love working on a product that our own team uses all day every day.
yeah,
It really accelerates our ability to kind
yeah,
of get insight into how things really feel. And often ideas that start off seeming good on paper really are not good, and you can find that out very quickly in dev. And then after that, yeah, it's just a ton of feature flagging. So at any one time, we're toggling all these flags and working with, um, reaching out to users who are early testers for things, getting early feedback from, often it'll be like power users who are really excited about a particular new thing. Sometimes it'll be the opposite, people who have never used Notion, we want them to try something. So it really depends. But generally, by the time something ships GA at Notion, it's been through a lot of usage by a lot of people internally and externally. And so we kind of have a sense of how it's going to land.
Yeah, it's interesting. You said reaching out to power users and early adopters. So do you have like a cohort of people that you proactively reach out to and say, hey, try out this stuff because it might be cool before it goes out to everyone?
There's a lot of those. One is we have a program called the Notion Ambassadors, which are a group of Notion, maybe I'll call them like mega power users. There are a lot of them, are educators of how to use Notion. A lot of them probably know more about Notion than me, And so we often work with them to get feedback on early things, and they have great intuitions, of course. And there's various other early access programs and waitlists and stuff we run. But I love it because being closer to users is ultimately the way to build good stuff, I think. And so even small stuff like, I find if I'm talking to a user in Slack versus over email, it feels like I can talk to them more, things like that.
Yeah, it's true. I think, the tool matters a lot in these things, even if, practically speaking, might not seem like a big thing, but tools have meaning, right? And email is different from Slack or Discord, and the expectations are different, and latency is different, and
And it's also relationship building. I think my goal as a product builder is to kind of have users outside of Notion who I am really friendly with and can just like reach out and have honest conversations with, and I know they're going to tell me good stuff.
Yeah. And you mentioned your style of contribution is hybrid in the sense that you, to use your word, you inject your taste both when it comes to design and product building and actual technical work. So is this, let's say, full stack, broadly speaking, style of contribution usual at Notion, and maybe fueled and enabled more now by AI, or there's a lot of still functional, layered engineering, traditional pipelines between design, front end, back end, or it depends on the team? How is it?
I think this has always been kind of a spectrum where you just draw arbitrary lines at some point and call them different roles, right? It reminds me of I think like the Romance languages in Europe, originally were all just one blurred language, and then at some point it's like, this is French and this is Italian, but it's like, sort of arbitrary. It feels like the same thing to me.
Yeah. This is an insane reference that I really liked.
Yeah, I know you have a European audience, so I feel
that.
But it's similar, right? Like, I think the closer you get to one of those arbitrary boundaries, the more confused some people get, because they're like, wait, are you a designer or an engineer? But the reality is there have always been engineers who had great product taste but had deep technical background. There have always been people called designers who coded a lot. I do think, so AI is definitely contributing to the blurring, particularly around the less coding-centric designers being able to push heavily towards coding more. I don't think that typically means, literally shipping to production for most designers at Notion. Although, a small thing like fix this color, sure. Like shipping a new feature, less so. However, prototyping in the medium of code is happening a ton at Notion now. That means instead of starting in Figma, maybe you start in, we have this internal application called Prototype Playground, where it's just a place where everyone contributes their code prototypes and you can try them in the browser. And that's been really great for unlocking more interactive, riffing, and you can fork anyone's prototype and play with it. So
Yeah.
that's happening a lot. And I think everyone, wherever they were on that spectrum, can now step one or two steps closer to coding, right? Maybe a designer who previously could have hand coded prototypes can now ship to the production app behind
Yeah.
a flag, right? So that's been really exciting for me.
Yeah. I think we are still all figuring out how this new workflow should work in terms of, I mean, it feels like now that some things like prototyping, as you said, can be done at completely different speed than in the past. A lot of artifacts and old ways of working are hard to keep like in sync or aligned. I mean, you mentioned Figma, and I hear from many teams that, I mean, how do you reconcile the fact that you can create a prototype first, right? With the fact that we used to have like a giant Figma file that is this single source of truth of design, and we need to keep it in aligned and current with respect to what exists. I don't know if you're figuring out this or you found something that works.
Yeah, I don't know. Like, I don't even know if I would call Figma or the code more the source of truth. I think like the reality is that probably the components in the code
Yeah,
are the primary source, but we try to keep them synced or something. I think I've always been a code first designer.
mm,
And that's partially because I focus more on conceptuals than visual design. But I also think it's because, like, for me, the way I want to start, ideally, is hey, I shipped this to our internal space. Here's a demo video, and you can try it. And the quality of feedback you get from people trying something
yeah,
versus staring at a mock up of it is completely different.
yeah,
Um, Professional designers are pretty good at giving good feedback on mockups, but it's still different. And you just get better feel for the details of things. And like there's often subtle parts of the conceptual model that are hard to articulate in a mockup, but actually end up being really critical in reality. Um, something like it could be as simple as, hey, like this AI call actually takes 10 seconds in reality, and that means this whole thing feels really slow.
yeah,
With AI in particular, actually prototyping, you the medium is prompting and figuring out what you can get the AI to do. And you could have a really cool idea for something that AI can't do today with today's models. So it's
yeah.
pointless to try to build it. So for a lot of reasons, I think working in the medium of code early is really helpful.
Yeah, it's interesting because throughout my career, I worked with many people who were able to do both design and some engineering, and all of them invariably would do the two things at the same time. I mean, no one would do like a traditional handoff to themselves, right? I mean, I do design first and then coding. Nobody, because the answer I gave to myself is that I think that the process of discovering like concepts and abstractions, it's the same for both. I mean, and it's not like things linearly, appear in your head from one thing to the next, and you do things in order. But coding helps designing, and designing helps coding. And so it's messy, and you do the two things at the same time. I don't know if that's the same for you.
Totally. It's a feedback loop.
Yeah,
I think it's a conversation between the two, that it's a dance. And the visual representations you choose affect the mental model in the user's
yeah,
head. The conceptual model that you're deciding on can affect like the information architecture or the flows
yeah,
that make sense. It's all connected. And I think having it in one brain can be really helpful so you don't lose stuff in that transfer.
yeah,
And um, maybe the thing that I like most about coding agents is that I think it makes it much faster to sketch conceptual models because you can just like refactor type signatures and refactor
yeah,
the conceptual model of the code so fluidly that it gives you more um, like before, if you got the foundation wrong and you built the product experience, it would be like, well, it's too late. Like we can't change that. It'd be too much work. But now it feels like, sure, let's completely blow it up and it'll just take a day. And
yeah.
so I love that feeling of levity and play and experimentation.
Yeah, absolutely. I love it too, for what it's worth. So I have a final question is for this very final segment. What's coming next? I mean, for you, for Notion, what is it that you are the most excited to be working on right now?
The immediate thing on my mind is that my team is working on external agents in Notion, which we announced.
Yeah.
It's still in private alpha, and it's going to be starting to roll out next month. And so I'm really excited to see what our users do with coding agents and other agents in Notion. Um, I think continuing to expand our dev platform, the workers concept is going to extend beyond the initial use cases that we announced of data syncing and custom tools to do all sorts of other things with shipping custom code into Notion. And so, stay tuned for like new ways to extend Notion with code. And then the last thing I'll say is something that I'm personally really excited about is actually that point we got to about version control and oversight of agents. I think that this area of humans having good oversight over agents and setting guardrails so you can trust the agents to go do important work is an opportunity that we're well positioned to create great tools for, because
Yeah.
Notion is a place where you have content and context, and you have the agents, and we can bring it all together. And so I'm excited to kind of see us keep investing there.
Yeah, excited to see what's coming. Thank you, Geoffrey, again for coming to the show.
Thank you. It's great to chat with you.
Thank you so much for listening. If you found this chat valuable, you can subscribe to the show on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Also, please consider giving us a rating or leaving a review, as that really helps other listeners find the show. You can find all past episodes and learn more about the show at refactoring.fm. See you in the next episode.